Hello. 2 weeks ago, a popular fantasy booktuber Library of a Viking made a video called How Deep Does Fantasy Go? Exploring the genre's hidden iceberg, in which he created one of those iceberg charts. And I'm sure you're familiar with the iceberg chart, right? You create a multi-level schema for different bits of arcana or lore or memes in your subculture or culture of choice, where generally the idea is above the iceberg you would have the normie knowledge, and then the deeper down, the more twisted and depraved the knowledge becomes. Library of a Viking, Johan, made a video of one for the whole fantasy genre. I was linked to it on Reddit somewhere, I believe, and I found the chart, let's just say, deeply disappointing. Maybe I can even say terrible. Throughout this entire video, I'm going to try to keep my criticisms to the chart itself and not do ad hominem attacks at Johan, because he seems like a very nice guy, and it was nice of him to create a chart like this in the first place. But when I saw the video, I was apoplectic. Isn't that a good vocab word? Apoplectic. I was disturbed and upset, and after brooding on it for a while, I sort of came up with three big critiques of the chart. And I guess I'm gonna try showing it to you, maybe in this video or what have you. Maybe it's scrolling down right now. But number one, the chart is positively anemic. There's only, like 25, 30 titles listed in totality to kind of encapsulate the entire fantasy genre. And the thing is, Library of a Viking, like many of these other booktubers, especially fantasy booktubers, makes it a point of pride that he's read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books from a very diverse set of series and authors. And so I think, like, why wouldn't you populate this more if you've clearly have the books to put on there, right? Like, surely you can have more in the charts. But actually, you know what? Maybe this is leading to my second critique, which is to say, the way he framed the chart is how the quote-unquote average fantasy reader would get into fantasy, except he posits that the average fantasy reader is only getting into it through book talk and booktube, which is to say, above the iceberg is all the fantasy series that normies are familiar about, and then I think he says that the second layer is what you would discover from having lightly browsed booktube and getting into online fantasy culture. And then the third layer is like, what if you're deep in online fantasy culture? And then like layers 4 and 5, like 4 is like what no one on booktube has ever talked about ever. And layer 5 is stuff he only included because a author recommended it to him at the con. And he says that, like, oh, this is like the most obscure, the most arcane stuff that's ever read. You know, like he hadn't read any of them. He didn't even feel comfortable reading any of them because he just thought that they would be so challenging. And though, to be fair to him, he says that maybe he'll get around to them one day, which then leads to my third critique, which is the framing that this iceberg is the entirety of what the fantasy genre has to offer, which I guess goes back into my first critique. It's a whole Ouroboros of criticism, which is to say, hey, this is not all the fantasy genre has to offer. There is an infinite amount of books. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books that could go on an iceberg like this. And to only list these few books as entirely representative of the genre, I found myopic. I think in some online rants to friends, I even said solipsistic. I was very frustrated by the framing that, if I recall correctly, the three books he has in the bottom tier are Gormenghast, uh, Book of the New Sun, and oh, that's right, Viraconium by M. John Harrison. And he sort of posited these three as the most difficult that the genre has to offer. And that also disturbed me because I find that in a lot of booktube discourse, people kind of voluntarily put ceilings on themselves. They say, this is the hardest book. I couldn't I couldn't ever try it because it's just like too hard and too obscure. There's so many books that are more obscure than that. I mean, like Book of the New Sun is just like one of the most famous fantasy books of all time, whether you like it or not. Maybe not in like certain circles, but it is, it's a book that got reviewed in Newsweek or whatever. That might be bullshit. But the point is that it's like a lot of these books that he dismissed as being too obscure actually have like huge fandoms and huge lasting impacts. But in response to this, because I was brooding on this for a couple of days, like just imagine me playing Elden Ring Night Rain, being bad at it, and just having it at the back of my head. I'm just like losing against, I don't know, Margit or whoever, because I'm just brooding like, wow, that fantasy chart was so bad. It was just like getting under my skin. So what I did is I woke up one morning and just like the first thing I was like, I have to do something about this. And so I just spent 2 straight hours clacka 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 typing up my own fantasy chart, which I hope you will find an improvement over it, because I tried to address each of the three critiques I had with the original chart, which is to say it has an infinite load more books. It has like a wider range of genres. Obviously it's not like 100% thorough, but I tried to make it as thorough as I can manage. But I know that I have limitations too. And even with all of my own research and experience, there's obvious blind sides. And I hope that you will correct me, and then hopefully we can make an even better chart going forward. And then the final one is, as I said before, I didn't like the framing of every fantasy reader discovers these books through BookTube and BookTube alone. And so this only books that are popular on BookTube are worthy to go on a chart. But the way that I framed it is through accessibility, which is to say, how comfortable would someone be diving into these books with little or no preparation? Golly, it's so big. I'm sorry. I hope you can read all of this okay. As you can see, I really wanted to make sure that I left no stone unturned. And so I filled up all available space that I had basically with all of these different titles. If I were to make a second draft of this, I would shrink the font just a little bit so I could put even more titles in, but I hope you find this legible. Let me lead you through this little adventure, section by section, just as the original video is structured. As you can see, I opted to do 7 layers, kind of because that's what the template I ended up getting had, and I thought, okay, 7 layers allows for a little more nuance and complexity than the original 5 layers. What the first layer ended up being is the fantasy that you would get to when you are a precocious youth who is getting into not just fantasy, but reading for the first time. There's lots of like classic children's literature, YA. Something I want to say up front is that the reason why I framed it around accessibility is it sort of provides, I would say, a modicum of more objectivity rather than just like these are the most popular to the most obscure, because different people are familiar with different types of literature, and so it's really hard for anyone to dictate what makes a work more obscure versus less obscure. And B, it is not in terms of difficulty, though difficulty often does correlate with accessibility, nor importantly does it correlate with quality. I want to say up front, because I'll tell you, I am a disgusting hipster, and I like books that are harder and whatnot. But I put it this way so that there are books that I love. There are books that I would die for in every single layer of this, to remove as much bias on my part as possible. Which is to say, if something is in a higher tier, that doesn't mean it's any worse than, or less worthy than books in lower tiers. I just want you to know that. So anyway, this first level, not too much to say about this, so I will just go on to the second tier. The second tier ends up being a lot of what you would read in your, I would say, early to mid teenage years. Artsy YA like Sabriel, The Neverending Story. I also have adult series on here that are kind of known for their accessible or YA adjacent prose, like Mistborn, Red Rising, etc., Legends and Lattes. And then I also have starter epic fantasy, like Dragonlance. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third layer. I would say that the third layer is what I think a lot of people would call the default layer of fantasy accessibility. These are mostly books that if you're to go to R Fantasy, or you were to go to Goodreads, or you're trying to get into fantasy for the first time, these are the books that you would be recommended. It's the Wheel of Time, it's the Stormlight Archives, but it also includes more critical favorites like N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season. I also put in some older books that might be more obscure to current readers, but would have historically been sort of put in around this layer, like Belgariad and the Deed of Paxenarian. All right, I am going to move on to the next level. Oh, actually, no, I knew I was forgetting something. If you're looking at the first three levels so far, I would say my biggest noted blind spot in this list, and this will be true for the list of the whole, is that I do not really have any romantasy. I'm not doing that out of spite, or I'm not saying it's not real fantasy, that's not a conversation I want to litigate right now. I didn't put it A because by the time it occurred to me, I had already filled up this whole chart, but B, I am not familiar enough with the genre and not comfortable enough with the genre for me to make huge assumptions about where it would go. Actually, in my original draft, as in when I first started typing in the first 5 minutes, I had Fourth Wing in the very top layer. What made Fourth Wing and books of its ilk so popular is just because they're very accessible in terms of prose and characterization, but then they also have smut scenes, which means adults want to read them as well, right? But as I sort of put more and more things on the chart, I kind of realized that, oh, it's kind of weird to have all of these novels for children than having Fourth Wing up there as well. I guess I was gonna put Sarah J. Maas on here, but again, I don't know her work well enough to sort of authoritatively place it anywhere. But in my mind, most romantasy would kind of go around the third layer. Does that sound about right? The average fantasy reading adult would be comfortable reading books between layers 3 and 5. I would say that layer 3 is just very accessible mainstream fantasy, but for people who want more of a literary bite, you would go down to layer 4, and then if you want even more literary, you would go down to layer 5. You notice that layer 4 does have a lot of, again, favorites for people who are more renowned for their prose. Guy Gavriel Kay, Patricia McKillip, Robin Hobb. You also have The Lord of the Rings here, right? You have Dune here. You also have a lot of sword and sorcery stuff on here, or sort of grim, dark books that might not be as accessible to current readers. I'm just sort of looking like Conan the Barbarian, Elric, Lankmar, of course, Fafford and Grey Mouser. In level 5, I would say this is just straight up literary fantasy. This is the bottom of Library of Vikings list, because we do have Book of the New Sun, we do have Vericonium. I did put Gormenghast in here as well, but I populated it with a lot of other books, like the Tolkien Silmarillion. Oh, I put Malazan down here as well, which, of course, I think is one of the biggest popular critiques of the original list. Where's Malazan? Where's Malazan? Again, I don't want to speak definitively, but I think that for the average fantasy reader, this is sort of like the maximum complexity. But then we also have literary non-fantasy as well. I'm talking about like Italo Calvino. If you read something like Invisible Cities, that's not a hard book to read, but it is secretly a very dense book. And it's not necessarily crafted for the fantasy genre, which leads us into layer 6. But it does include a lot of more literary books with a fantasy twist to them. As you can see, I have a ton of magical realism on here. We got Salman Rushdie, we have Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jorge Luis Borges. If you were to read anything from this section, I would recommend you read Ficciones by Borges. It will change the way you evaluate every single book higher up on this list. We also have literary classics. I'm looking at the Ramayana, I'm looking at Paradise Lost, which, even though they're not crafted as part of the fantasy genre, they inform modern fantasy enough that I think that they would branch together with them comfortably. But then you also have some like more early 20th century authors that I think a modern reader might find a little more difficult to get into, like James Branch Cabell and Clark Ashton Smith. I would say that kind of the sore thumb here is Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I put it down there for me, which is to say it's one of the only books I ever tapped out where I'm like, okay, this is too much for me. And I want to go back to it eventually, but I'm like this book is hardcore. I cannot handle it right now. Which isn't an insult, that's a compliment. And then finally, let's get down to the bottom level, mostly filled with works of literature that have informed modern fantasy. I'm looking at the Nibelungenlied, Beowulf, the Mahabharat. It also has notoriously difficult books from early 20th century fantasy, like Voyage to Arcturus, E.R. Edison, the works of William Morris and Charles Williams. I guess William Morris is late 19th century, not early 20th century, but you know. The only really contemporary stuff I include on here is Alan Moore's Jerusalem. I also have his comic Promethea, because that comic is very dense and insane. John Crowley's Egypt Cycle. A lot of the books down here, if they are more contemporary, like again, Egypt Cycle or Foucault's Pendulum, require a certain level of metatextual knowledge about literature as a whole, or about history and whatnot, which make it, again, very difficult to jump into if you aren't explicitly ready to jump in. If I had to guess of like what the single bottommost book in this section would be, like the single most difficult and inaccessible book for a current reader, I would guess The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which is an unfinished and nevertheless 1,300 page long epic fantasy poem written in Shakespearean English about going on quests. And it's all allegory for how you're supposed to use different virtues and whatnot. I tried reading it once. I noped out after half a page. I guess you could maybe include Finnegan's Wake in here by James Joyce. But as you can see, this bottom layer is where the genre definitions of fantasy start to break down, because maybe we shouldn't get into like what counts as fantasy. I will make the basic assertion: for something to be in a genre, then it has to intentionally write itself towards being in that genre, which is to say a book is fantasy if the author is trying to write a fantasy book. And when someone is trying to write towards a certain genre, they often put like little, they shave off the edges a little bit so that it'll fit more cleanly in that genre. Pretty much everything in the bottom layer doesn't have these genre protections, so to speak. Okay, I hope that wasn't too rambly these last 10 minutes, but I hope you can understand my thinking. And I also want to assert one more time that this is by no means holistic or complete. This is a living list which can always be added onto, because I am very acutely aware that there's probably huge blind spots that I have that it didn't even occur to me, even with as many books are listed here. And if you feel like I have any major blind spots, please tell me. I'll leave off with one more point. What frustrated me so much about the original list, or I should say the original video, not necessarily the list, is when talking about books like Gormenghast or Vericonium, Johann often stated like, this is so difficult, it's too difficult for me to even dare to try. And I feel that like a lot of people reading fantasy say like, I can't possibly read that. Actually, not even fantasy. I think just most people reading today, most people just reading books. And I'm including myself here. Everyone says like, I can't possibly read that. That is too difficult and I don't want to feel dumb. So I won't try reading that book, or I won't try reading that book until I am in the headspace that I am willing to feel dumb or humiliated by my attempt to read this book. And what I will say in response to that is, you are smarter than you think you are. I think that most books on this list you can read right now, and maybe there'll be a hump at first, but I think you'll be rewarded by it. You know, I thought Moby Dick would be too hard. And then I just sat down and read Moby Dick one day, and I was like, dang, this is a really funny and clever book. It's rip-roaring hilarious. I will use Book of the New Sun as an example here. Again, everyone says like, oh, Book of the New Sun is so hard. You don't even know what the plot is. Oh, there's so much going on. You don't even know what's going on. But what makes Book of the New Sun so wonderful is that it totally works on the level of a sword and sorcery novel. And then it has deeper layers that you can dig down into if you want to. And you will be rewarded if you dig down into the deeper layers. But you don't have to. And if you don't, then you can enjoy the upper layers, just like this list. You can enjoy the upper layers and you'll be just fine. I'm thinking of chapter 4 of Shadow of the Torturer, which is the first book in that series, the chapter Triskele, where we see the young Severian, who is our protagonist. He is this boy who is raised to be a torturer in a far distant future. And because of that, he's low-key sort of a sociopath, but he is a sociopath who is trying to become better. And that is the story of Book of the New Sun. And in chapter 4, he's just like a 9-year-old, you know, he's just going around doing errands, you know, bringing people torture instruments and whatnot. And he finds a dog who he names Triskele. He finds a 3-legged dog, I think just in a trash heap, just kind of bleeding out or something. And Severian, as a torturer, has only been educated in the ways of pain. But because he knows how to manipulate nerves, he knows how to tear open human flesh, he is able to perform surgery on this dog and save the dog's life. And now he has a cute 3-legged dog who is his best friend in a world where, you know, no torture boy gets to have his own dog. He has his own dog. But when you go back and read through the chapter, you sort of get all these different clues that Triskele is maybe not really a dog. Triskele is maybe some 9 foot long mutant animal with giant jaws and like poison saliva and maybe a gajillion eyes or something. And you can find those hints that sort of indicate, just how complex the world building of Book of the New Sun is. But at the end of the day, it's the story of a boy and his dog. And you can enjoy it for the story of a boy and his dog. And so my plea to you is that I hope that you are able to look at this list and find something in, whatever reading level you're most comfortable at. You're able to find a new book to try out. But I would challenge you, try a book from the lower layers, something that you might have previously thought too intimidating or difficult. And I can't promise, but I sincerely hope that you will find that it's not so bad. It's not nearly as bad as you thought it would be. Reading is a world of infinite possibilities, infinite portals to other worlds, but you won't know unless you try them out. Anyway, thank you for thank you for watching through my big ol' rant or whatever. I'm gonna make this for the thumbnail. I might do some sort of bullshit clickbait. Um, anyway, I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye. I love you.